Hello again, and welcome to the next webinar dedicated, in this case, to the nutritional strategies for zinc oxide reduction. This is the agenda that we are going to follow today. We are going to start with an introduction, analyzing the evolution of the nutritional programs in the past, let's say, 20 years. Then we are going to see how we can improve the post-weaning states with the application and with the stimulation of early feed intake. Then we will dedicate some time to the diet formulation, including some words about the selection of raw materials. We will also speak about protein. We will also speak about calcium and about fiber. And finally, I am going to explain or suggest a few tools for improving the gut health management. As we already saw in the past webinar, when we want to replace zinc oxide or zinc oxide and antibiotics, in the post-weaning state, the approach should be global. We should play on different fields: hygiene, sound nutrition, management, health. And today we are going to focus on nutrition, talking about the feed formulation, etc., and also on the gut health management, how with certain feed additives we can improve this intestinal health. When looking at the evolution of the nutritional programs in the post-weaning phase during the past 20 years, here the message that I would like to give you is that when I started working as a piglet nutritionist around 20 years ago, the diets, they were evaluated, so a diet was good or bad, depending mainly on performance and depending also, a diet was good if the protein level of the diet was the highest as possible. Today, that has changed due to regulation, due to the evolution of the needs as well. And today, when looking into the weaning feed and the pre-starter feed, so in the immediate post-weaning state, the diets are really looking more into gut health, and they care much less about the performance during those stages. And then the performance becomes more important after the starter feed. So when the piglets are already quite, let's say, ready, quite mature as well, and they are weighing, let's say, 12 kilos or more, then performance becomes more and more important. With an additional message here, what we have learned along this time as well is that if we are successful on keeping a good gut health during these stages immediately after weaning, the performance will be later on positively affected. So it is worthy to focus on the gut health at the very beginning, while later on those piglets are going to perform much better. And when we look at how these diets for the weaner feed and for the pre-starter feed, so this specific part that has been looking more into the gut health, how they have been evolving. And this is an adaptation from a publication from John Plusk from Australia. What we see is that the energy in those first diets today is lower compared to 20 years ago. The crude protein level, and probably this is something that you already know, the crude protein level is also lower, involving as well the total amino acid level as well. Lactose has kept more or less equal. We are working today in nutrients like insoluble fiber, because certain amounts of insoluble fiber, they favor the development of the intestine of the piglet. And then something else that I will mention a little bit later is that the calcium level has also been reduced compared to 20 years ago. When it comes to the selection of raw materials and feed additives for those first diets, animal protein sources are more widely used. Vegetal concentrates, they have also increased their inclusion in the diets, and the one that we have been reducing is the inclusion of soybean meal. We are also working today more with technological feed additives like probiotics and prebiotics in those first stages, including also enzymes such as an example, phytase. And finally, we are also increasing the antioxidative capacity of the feed through the application of vitamin E and primary and secondary antioxidants. So now let's start with some tips, some advices that we should follow ideally when we want to produce piglets and we want to reduce the risk of diarrhea after weaning. And here the first advice is to offer the piglets a crib feed, a good crib feed, I would add, which is the application of a solid diet to the piglets while they are still suckling the sow. The objective of this application of a crib feed before weaning is not really to improve the weaning weight, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. So it is not a direct objective of improving the weight at weaning time, but it is more looking into what is going to happen once we separate the piglets from the mother. So the objectives here are really looking into the post-weaning phase. And what we are trying to do is get the piglets used to eat solid feed so that at the time in which the solid feed is going to be the only nutrient source that they have, the milk from the sow is no longer available, the piglets are really able to understand that this is what they should eat, and they are going to eat it, let's say, more or less fast right after weaning. Here, with this slide, I would only like to emphasize that the application of a crib feed is not at all replacing the sow's milk. Actually, the milk represents approximately 80% of the energy intake of the suckling piglets, and that is going to still be there even if we apply a crib feed. So the crib feed is not aiming to replace the milk, but it is really, let's say, helping to prepare the piglets for the post-weaning stage. As you can see here, when we are weaning the piglets at around 3 or 4 weeks of age, there is not much difference in weight between those piglets that are receiving only milk and the piglets that are receiving milk and crib feed. But the difference that we can observe, we are going to see it later on. And here, this is an old graph and an old publication from Eric Bruinings, but I think that it is quite useful, and we are still using it since many years ago. Here in this trial, they analyzed the eating behavior of the piglets after weaning, and they compared piglets that had been eating crib feed. So here they are illustrated as eaters, and piglets that were not offered the crib feed. In this case, it is the no feed broken line. And here, this is the number of hours post-weaning that each group took to start eating again after weaning. As you see here, if we stop at 12 hours. So 12 hours after weaning, what we see is that those piglets that were eating creep feed before weaning, 90% of the piglets are already eating feed again after weaning, while in the no creep feed group, only 60 to 70% of the piglets are eating feed after weaning 12 hours later. If we go a little bit later, so if we go to 24 hours, in this case, all the piglets in the creep feed group, so this line here has finally disappeared. So all the piglets that were fed creep feed before weaning are already eating feed as well after weaning, in 1 day after weaning. While in the non-creep feed group, they are only 70 to 80% of the piglets that are eating feed after weaning. For the non-creep feed group, it takes close to 50 hours, so more than 2 days, to have all the piglets eating feed right after weaning. For those piglets that do not eat feed for 2 days after weaning, that is very dangerous for them because the intestine is going to suffer from an atrophy and they are not going to be, let's say, later on well prepared to the time when they start to receive feed again. So here, the message that I wanted to tell you is that the creep feed is used to reduce neophobia. Neophobia is, let's say, it's a little bit like children. When we introduce a new ingredient, they take time, they don't want to eat. With the piglets, it's more or less the same. When we wean the piglets, they are also going to take time, but through the application of a creep feed, we can reduce the time they will take to eat feed after weaning. And this is more or less the same reflected in another study done by Theo van Kempen. In this case, what he was measuring was the number of visits to the trough, but also he was analyzing the percentage of successful visits, meaning that when the piglet goes to the trough, the piglet is actually eating feed. And as you can see, there is a very clear difference between those piglets that had been offered creep feed before weaning and the piglets that had not been offered creep feed before weaning. Actually, for the creep feed eaters, the percentage of successful visits to the trough is much higher and very clearly higher compared to the non-creep feed eaters. Okay, now we move to the next section. And in the next section, what we are going to analyze is the palatability of certain ingredients, of certain raw materials. There is a Spanish researcher, David Solá-Oriol, that a few years ago, he was working doing a preference trial. So he offered 2 feeds at the same time for the piglets so that the piglets could choose one feed or the other. And he was playing with several raw materials, analyzing which was the preferred feed for the piglets at that time. I would like to give you only a few conclusions. And here, just as an example, when we compare extruded barley and extruded corn, you see how the piglets prefer the extruded forms of those 2 cereals, barley and corn, rather than the raw barley and the raw corn. Another point as well, when it comes to the selection of raw materials, you can also see here how the preference for naked oats, so oats that have been dehulled in piglets, in very young piglets, is higher compared to the other cereals. And when it comes to naked oats, if we extrude them, then the preference is much higher, even when we include it at 300 grams per kilo at 30% inclusion rate. Then in that case, the preference was reaching up to 90% of the, out of the consumption of the 2 feeds that were offered, the piglets selected 90% of the extruded naked oats feed rather than the control feed. These feeds, they were all tested against the same control. This is why they are comparable one column with the others. That was in relation with cereals. When it comes to proteins, what we can also see is that the protein composition, the raw materials that we supply in the feed, that we include in the feed to supply protein, they are also having a strong influence on the palatability and on the preference of the feed. Just to mention some common protein sources, what we can see here is that when we include soybean meal at a high inclusion rate, 20%, the preference is very low. The piglets don't like to eat that big amount of soybean meal in the diet. We can also see the same with the potato protein, but with the potato protein, even at very low levels, the preference, the palatability is very low. Instead, when we select some animal proteins, as an example, fish meal, at 5% inclusion rate or 10% inclusion rate, then the preference is quite high. They prefer that feed much more than the control feed. So one of the messages that I would like to give you here from this slide is that the protein source that we apply has a strong influence on the palatability, on the feed intake of the piglets. And coming from this, we can also generalize that the application of animal proteins is typically more palatable than the application of vegetal proteins, and especially than the application of soybean meal. Now we are going to have a look to the enzymatic digestion of proteins. So we continue speaking about proteins, and I would like to here shortly explain why reducing protein level is going to help us to keep the piglets healthier and to reduce the risk of diarrhea. When we have a look to the digestion of proteins, it starts in the stomach, and in the stomach is the first place where the chemical digestion starts, denaturating the protein and activating the pepsin. But in order to do that, the piglet needs to reduce the pH in the stomach lower than 3. One of the issues that we face in piglets is that they don't have a strong capacity yet, because they are immature, to bring down the gastric pH very low, meaning that the enzymatic digestion of proteins is not starting correctly. And this is why the piglets are not going to be very efficient to digest proteins. This is why we need to offer them very digestible proteins. If we don't do that, the proteins will not be properly digested in the small intestine, and then that means that a big amount of proteins will reach the final part of the small intestine and also the hindgut. Here, the nitrogen, the amino acids, the protein, they will work as a nutrient for the microbial populations there. And the microbial populations, they can use the protein to ferment, but this is a negative fermentation, because as a consequence of that, they will increase the ammonia production. They will also increase the production of branched short-chain fatty acids, amines, escatol, toxic compounds, bad smells, etc. And this microbial fermentation of the protein rich in the hindgut will increase the risk of diarrhea. This is why there are two conclusions that I would like to give you from this slide. First, we should offer proteins that are very digestible for the piglets. Actually, ideally, we should offer proteins that more or less don't need to follow a digestion process in order to be absorbed. And apart from that, we should try to reduce the amount of proteins reaching the hindgut. I would like to also include something else. When we analyze digestibility of proteins in piglets, many studies have been done with older animals, so not really in piglets right after weaning. Why? Because it is very difficult, it is very variable, the feed intake is also playing a role, so it is really difficult to obtain protein digestibility immediately after weaning. What does that mean? That many of the data that we utilize that are included in tables, in official tables, they are overestimating digestibility of protein for the piglets. Again, because maybe they are working with piglets which are 10 days after weaning, 15 days after weaning, but not really just after weaning. And the capacity, the maturity of the intestine of the piglets right after weaning is actually not the same as a few weeks later. So here, when we are talking about the protein digestion and the protein digestibility, as I told you, we should try to select raw materials that have a high protein digestibility for piglets. As you can see, there are some raw materials like fish meal, like animal plasma, or like a soybean protein concentrate that they are offering a high protein digestibility, while some other raw materials, just as an example here, the corn DDGS, the digestibility of in this case, the digestibility of the lysine is very low, meaning that it is a raw material which is not going to be useful for piglets because a big part of the protein included in the corn DDGS will finally reach the hindgut and will be fermented by the microorganisms. But a new concept that I also would like to introduce, and I think that it is becoming more and more important, and more we will take it into account in our formulations, is the kinetics of protein digestion. So not just the final digestibility, which is measured at 2 days after starting the digestion process, but what is happening at the very beginning. So how easily the piglets are able to absorb that protein. And here I would like to show you how some raw materials, again here we speak about potato protein, at the very beginning of the digestion process, the digestibility of the protein, the absorption of that protein is very low. Some other raw materials like soybean meal is a little bit better than the potato protein, but as you can see, even 3 hours after starting the digestion process, it is not, by the way, too high. Fish meal is better, but you can see how at the very beginning, so when the protein is coming out from the stomach, the protein absorption is something between 50 and 60%. And here I would like to speak about Yella Prosecure, which is a product that I will speak later on by the end of the presentation, which is able to provide a very fast protein source for the piglets. And what does that mean? That with this kind of protein source, the piglets don't need to dedicate a big effort to digest this protein, and they are going to be very easily uptaking it from the intestine. Following this, we could classify the different proteins, the protein sources, between fast proteins, which would be more or less these ones, medium proteins, which would include all these sources, and resistant proteins, which, just as an example, the potato protein would be part of it. Now, a few words about calcium. With calcium, we need to be careful because, well, we understand that limestone, which is typically used as a source of calcium, is probably the most economic ingredient that we can include in the piglet diet. But we need to take into account that calcium is not inert in the digestive tract. So it will affect, first of all, it has a very high acid binding capacity, meaning that if we are introducing a big amount of limestone into the feed, we are going to make it even more difficult to the piglets to bring down the pH in the stomach. But apart from that, calcium has some negative effects on the digestibility of energy and fat, and also on the digestibility of phosphorus linked to phytate. So if we are applying phytates, if we apply at the same time a big amount of limestone, the phytase efficiency is going to be reduced, and it is also affecting reducing the protein solubility. This is an example of a trial done by Lallemand, comparing no inclusion of limestone and therefore a very low dietary calcium percentage in the diet, and inclusion of 1.55% of limestone. As you can see here, the piglets were performing much better when there was no inclusion of limestone at all, rather than a high inclusion of limestone. And actually, I mean, I personally have the same experience as Laia. So to me, limestone is an ingredient that I would say that if we are using some phosphorus source, we can skip the limestone at least from the first 1 or 2 weeks after weaning. Now we can dedicate some words to fiber and to the different types of fiber that we can apply in piglets. Here, I don't want to enter too deep into the topic because it's a big one, it's a big topic. I would like to just to mention a few things. First of all, that fiber composition is complex. So you know that we can analyze the fiber different ways, and we can separate different portions of fiber. Some fiber components are highly fermentable and are typically also soluble fibers, and these can be used very easily by the microbes which are living in the hindgut, and they can produce energy out of those fiber sources. But these soluble fibers, they are slowing down the gastric emptying. They are increasing as well the viscosity of the liquid part of the intestinal content, and they are limiting the speed of filling up of the small intestine. But on the positive side, they are these kind of soluble fibers. They are providing more energy to the piglets in the form of short-chain fatty acids. And on the other hand, when we move to the right in the fiber composition, so when we look to the hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin, these are insoluble fibers. Some part of them, they can be fermentable, but the fermentation is slower, meaning that they are going to provide energy to the piglets, but a long time. They are going to be more constant a long time. But these kind of fibers, they are the reason why they are useful for piglets, and today there is a big trend to work with insoluble fibers in the piglet feeds, is first because they work on they have a clutter effect, meaning that when they move along the intestine, they are like cleaning, washing the intestinal content, and also they have an action on the peristaltism, and they are increasing the intestinal welfare some way. The piglets are going to feel better when we are including insoluble fibers. Here we need to be careful with something. When applying some levels of insoluble fibers is positive, is going to favor the digestion of all other nutrients. But if we are too high, we are probably going to impact negatively, because a big part of those insoluble fibers, the piglets are not really able to use them. And probably then in that case, we would be decreasing the global digestibility of the feed. This is a trial done by Francesc Molist, and here he was comparing two different sources of fiber, wheat bran on one hand and sugar beet pulp in the other hand, and he was also playing with a combination of both wheat bran and sugar beet pulp. Here he was analyzing the total short-chain fatty acid concentration at day 10 and also at day 15. Sugar beet pulp is a kind of example of a fiber source which is especially rich in soluble, while wheat bran is richer in insoluble fibers. So here what we see is that when we apply both type of fibers together or separated, we are increasing the concentration of short-chain fatty acids, while when we are applying sugar beet pulp, we are increasing that concentration of short-chain fatty acids at day 10. Also, when we look more specifically to the butyric acid, which is, I would say, the most interesting short-chain fatty acid for the piglets, we are especially increasing it when we are applying wheat bran in both diets, wheat bran alone or wheat bran in combination with the sugar beet pulp. And instead, when we are looking into the enterobacteria, what we see here is that with both fiber sources, they were able to reduce the enterobacteria concentration, but this reduction was especially stronger when they applied the combination of both fiber sources. And then now I would like to move to the gut health management tools. And here I would like to introduce a very recent review by Nuria Kanive and her team, so from the University of Aarhus in Denmark, which was published around 1 month ago, so it's very, very fresh. First of all, so this is a review on preventive measures to reduce post-weaning diarrhea in piglets. And as you can see here, and it is in relation with the previous slide, she was also speaking about the application of insoluble fiber rather than soluble fibers to prevent post-weaning diarrhea in piglets. But apart from that, and already looking into the feed additives that we can include into the piglet feeds, she was proposing several modes of action to prevent post-weaning diarrhea in piglets: the establishment of a robust gut microbiota, the promotion of the maturation of the gut before weaning. We have seen that with the crib feed application, inhibition or reduction of the growth of pathogens, the promotion of the growth of beneficial bacteria, and the modulation of the immune response and the provision of immune protection. What I am highlighting here in green color is that the probiotics, they are efficient tools to work on most of these suggested modes of action to prevent post-weaning diarrhea. So probiotics, they are useful tools to help into that prevention. And what is the mechanism of action of probiotics to fight against post-weaning infections? We can divide the actions in two. One is a preventive action, so working mainly on the animal, on the intestinal mucosa, creating a favorable intestinal environment. And here we can see the stimulation of a resident microbiota and the action via the host physiology, so working with the immune system of the piglet. So in this case, this preventive action of the probiotics is really like setting up a robust environment so that when the piglets receive a challenge, that intestine, that microbiota is reacting better. And then they also have a protective action, which is a more direct action trying to reduce the pathogen overgrowth. And here we can see the direct inhibition of pathogens could be through the reduction of the pH, through the production of some antimicrobial peptides. So it is going to depend on the specific probiotic strain that we are using, but we can also expect a direct effect on the pathogens. It can also be as well binding the pathogen directly to the surface of the probiotic, and this way not allowing it to multiply. So now, and to finish the presentation, I would like to explain you the different tools that Lallemand has in the portfolio, at least some of them, that can help you producing piglets after weaning, and that can reduce as well the risk of diarrhea after weaning. We are going to speak about a probiotic, Lebus LSB, a specific strain of Boulardii. We are going to speak about a prebiotic, Yang, and we are also going to speak about an alternative protein source, which is Yella Prosecure. And the actions that we are going to see from each of them are the following. With the probiotic, we are going to support the maturity of the intestinal structure, and we are going to reduce inflammatory responses. We are also going to favor a balanced and resilient microbiota. With the prebiotic, Yang, we are going to have two effects. On one hand, we are binding undesirable bacteria and helping to reduce the diarrhea incidence. And also, we are going to modulate the immune system through several pathways. Finally, with Yella Prosecure, which is a hydrolyzed yeast, we are going to stimulate the early feed intake, and we are going to provide qualitative functional protein for the piglets. Starting with the probiotic, I would just like to show you a couple of slides, a couple of examples showing the effect of the probiotic. This is a trial that was done in the year 2020 in Mexico, and here they compared a positive control, which is this column here and here, which was a medicated feed containing antibiotics, a negative control here with no antibiotics, and two different yeasts. One was Lebus LSB, Boulardii, here completely in black, and the other one was another different yeast, but not Boulardii. Here, among other things, because they were measuring several things, they measured the intestinal the intestinal villi height of the piglets, which is also what you can see here on the pictures. As you see, the application of the antibiotics was for sure having an impact of the intestinal villi. The negative control group had much shorter villi compared to the positive control group. While when we are applying the probiotic, the intestinal villi are at the same level as in the positive control group. And this is actually the same as we saw in this other trial, in which we challenge the piglets with a mycotoxin with a strong dose of fumonisin B1. And here what we can see is that when the piglets were receiving the probiotic before being challenged with the mycotoxin, they were kind of protected. They were still able to have the same villi height as in the control non-challenged group. This is a trial that was published this year, 2022, in March in the United States. It is an independent trial, and here they compare 3 different programs. One program including a high dosage of zinc and copper, both of them used at pharmacological level. The same program, but including levus-LSB on top of that. And then the third program was having a much lower dose of zinc and copper, but instead of them, they were using levus-LSB to kind of replace it. So the results that I can show you here, they are performance results. As you can see, the piglets started with the same weight, but they finished when we apply levus-LSB on top, the final weight is higher. So we are with levus-LSB, we are improving the performance of the piglets. When they are applying levus-LSB as a replacement of the high level of zinc and copper, the performance was at the same level as in the control feed. Here, this is also what we can see when we analyze the average daily gain. So again, the average daily gain is improved by 8% when we apply levus-LSB on top. It is improved by 3%, not statistically, when we are applying levus-LSB as a replacement of the high zinc and copper. And the same we can observe with the feed conversion ratio, which is similar when we use levus-L as a replacement. It is lower, 6% lower when we are using it on top. Now we move to the prebiotic, to Young. As I mentioned before, Young is a prebiotic, and it is targeting 2 objectives. On one hand, it was especially selected to have a great capacity of binding pathogens, and I would say more specifically E. coli. And on the other hand, it provides a wide and balanced immune modulation because it is activating or working simultaneously with several immune receptors, and this is a very strong difference compared to single strain prebiotics. The capacity of binding pathogens was validated in vitro. So as you can see here, when we include increasing dosages of Young, we can reduce the E. coli population binding to epithelial cells, and we could even completely reduce that E. coli population, again, depending on the dosage of Young. Apart from that, it was validated in vivo in Schothorst Feed Research Center in the Netherlands, and here they applied a specific E. coli challenge with a specific E. coli strain that they have there in Schothorst, and they measured the fecal excretion of E. coli in the feces. As you can see here, during a few days after the challenge with E. coli, which was similar in both groups, the fecal excretion of E. coli was much higher in the control group compared to the Young group. And the reason why is because Young is binding the E. coli cells, and therefore it is not allowing them to multiply inside the intestine. Here, just as a reminder, the multiplication of E. coli is very fast, and actually E. coli can duplicate the population in just 20 minutes. And here I would also like to show you a trial that was performed in Korea, in your country, with the University of Dankook. In this case, we started with weaning piglets, and we applied what we consider are challenging sanitary conditions, because piglets were introduced in dirty rooms, in rooms that had not been cleaned after the previous batch. And we included young at 2 kilos per ton in the pre-starter feed, and then at 400 grams per ton in the starter feed. Here, these are the performance results. So in the group in which young was applied, there was a statistical improvement of the final weight, of the average daily gain, and the feed conversion ratio was also reduced, even though not, the impact was not statistically significant. And apart from that, something else that we were also able to observe in this study is that the genetic expression of some pro-inflammatory cytokines in the jejunum was lowered when we were applying young compared to the control, and this was effectively true for tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is a marker of inflammation in the intestine, TLR2 receptors, and interleukin-6. So in other words, what we could say is that part of the mode of action of young is happening through the modulation, through the reduction of the local intestinal inflammation right after weaning. And then we are going to finish with Yella Prosecure. Yella Prosecure is a hydrolyzed yeast. Hydrolyzed means that it has been kind of pre-digested. So the product that the piglet is eating is already, let's say, quite well, the molecules have been already quite well broken down, so that the digestibility of certain components, at least the protein components, is very high. In the case of Yella Prosecure, the hydrolysis process is very specific, so it is really made on purpose to increase the digestibility of the crude protein. So young, we can divide what young consists of on 3 different parts. On one hand, crude protein, it contains around 42% of crude protein, but this crude protein is mainly in the forms of free amino acids, small oligopeptides. And this is providing a protein digestibility higher than 94%. So it is a very highly digestible protein source. It also contains dietary fiber, around 40% of dietary fiber, and this dietary fiber is especially rich in insoluble dietary fiber. And that means that this fiber can be used as a slowly fermentable material for the microorganisms in the hindgut. And the rest of the product, the 18%, are bioavailable vitamins, minerals, trace elements, etc., that can be easily absorbed by the piglet. So here, we synthesize here what are the objectives that we have when we introduce Yella Prosecure in the piglet diet. On one hand, when we look to the protein part, we are looking for a fast assimilation. So we are looking for a synergistic absorption between the amino acids in Yella Prosecure and the starch coming from cereals, so that later on in the blood, we can find at the same time the protein source and the energy source. This fast assimilation of protein, the fact that the Yella Prosecure is made of very fast protein has a functional impact, working as a source of nutrients, source of amino acids for the intestinal mucosa. It is also playing a role on the umami receptor, so it will stimulate the feed intake of the piglets. And on the other hand, when we move to the final part of the intestine, thanks to the fiber portion of Yella Prosecure, we are we are having a positive effect on the colon microbiota. And here what is going to happen is that thanks to the microbial fermentation, we are going to see a gradual valorization of the dietary fiber fraction, increasing the microbial diversity, increasing the butyrate production, and reducing the proteolytic activity. And just to finish, I would like to share with you a few take-home messages. So on one hand, we have been speaking today about the evolution of the piglet nutritional programs. They have evolved towards safety, so not really much towards performance, but at least for the immediate post-weaning, the trend has been very clear, looking more for intestinal health rather than performance. We have also been dedicating some time to explain that the early management of feed intake through the application of creep feed is very important for the post-weaning response. Again, when we apply creep feed, we should be looking into what is going to happen after weaning. We are not really expecting the piglets to grow much faster under the creep feed before weaning, but we are expecting those piglets to eat easily the feed right after weaning. When formulating the piglet diets, we need to pay attention to the palatability of the feed ingredients. So depending on the feed ingredients that we choose to include into our diets, we will stimulate or not, or we could even have a negative impact on the palatability and feed intake of the piglets. It is important that we offer digestible proteins because the piglets are not yet ready to utilize the protein into the feed, but we should also be looking into the digestion kinetics. And this concept of protein digestion kinetics, it is a concept that we have not been using so much until now, but now there start to be many different publications, and I can tell you that it is a growing concept. We should also keep an eye on the calcium level, and here it is better, especially in the immediate post-weaning, to be low rather than have an excess of calcium. As I told you, calcium, especially limestone, has several negative impacts on the piglets, and the piglets can live for 1 or 2 weeks with very low levels of calcium. Okay, and finally, as we have also seen, fiber level, but also the fiber type, it is a very important trend nowadays in the feed formulation. There are many publications, and more we are using, especially insoluble fiber sources for piglets. But again, here we should keep an eye on the level. It is good, it is positive to apply some insoluble fiber, but we should not be too high because the piglets' fermentative capacity is much lower compared to the sows, just as an example. And then finally, with feed additives, we can help managing the gut health. There are several tools available, and here the advice is to work on a combination of different feed additives. But even when we speak about that combination, we can also set up a kind of hierarchy between the different alternatives that we have. And from that point of view, probiotics, as we have seen, are really at the top of the hierarchy. In our case, with Lewis LSB, it has been widely documented for several actions, and these actions are very useful for piglets right after weaning. Apart from that, we can complement that action with yang. The mode of action is different, so yang will mainly be working with the immune system, but also will be reducing the risk of negative microbial populations multiplying. And finally, a little bit different than feed additives, but we can also work with alternative protein sources, such as Yela Prosecure, which is a source of very fast protein, which does not require a strong digestive effort from the piglet, and slowly fermentable fiber, which is also going to help us keeping a positive microbial balance in the hindgut. With that, we finish the presentation. I would like to tell you thank you very much, Habsana Nida, and in case you have any question, please do not hesitate to ask me. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation.